All right, tonight we're going to keep talking about justice, and I want to remind you that a couple of definitions. We've talked about justice as the Hebrew word mishpat. It means to go to the root of something and set things right. I keep using the phrase justice is a call to love your neighbor, not a call to punish crime. I think that's very important. And the last time I taught on was justice and the vulnerables. I did 2 parts about the vulnerables and how every time justice, well, not every time, but a lot of the times when justice, it saturates the Bible. When the word mishpat is used and justice is spoken of, there's a list of people that's the same list of people over and over and over. And I kept making the point that it is a list of vulnerables, not a list of criminals. And that's the people that have God's heart. He wants to be known as a defender of the poor and a defender of the fatherless. That's his heart. That's who he is. That's how he wants to be known. So tonight I'm going to shift. I'm going to do a 2-part on this topic as well. I'm going to do 2 parts on justice and economics. I'm getting to the heart of the issue of what justice is really about. And when you talk about justice and the vulnerables, that's the heart of God and his heart for justice. It's for the vulnerable, helpless, powerless people. But that explicitly involves economic things. You can't read about justice and not read about economics and money and how that involves justice and injustice, because greed, envy, and all those type things. So I'm going to spend one message talking about the problems, and then I'm going to spend another message talking about the solutions. The Bible lists some very specific solutions that God listed that he wanted implemented that would help bring justice to a community or to a society. And then there are some economic problems, and I'm going to pull some scriptures from so listen to both of them. Be sure you listen to the fullness, because if you just listen to this one, and when I talk about the problems tonight, you won't see the fullness when I talk about the solutions and how it all fits together. So tonight I want to dive in, and I want us to look at some specific injustices that I'm going to bring out of the Bible, and then I'm going to apply them to some circumstances and situations in our day. And I'm going to be honest with you about this again up front. There are a lot of times I preach and I try to meet you where you are, and I'll preach very pastoral and I'll preach very evangelistic, and I'll be exhortive and encouraging and try to build you up in who you are. I'll try to bring God to meet you where you're at. This series is a deeper series. It's a more meaty, weightier series. And the purpose of this series is to challenge you to come and be where God is. So many times I'll preach and try to meet you where you're at, but with this one I'm trying to challenge you. So open your heart. Open your mind, be willing to focus with me as I get into some weightier matters, some deeper matters, a little bit more meaty. And I want to challenge us even with some cultural things that we see and some issues that we see in our society. And so it takes, it's a little bit heavier, has a little bit more weight. So be willing to hear and be willing to be challenged, and let's try to become more like God. So tonight's topic is economic justice and economics. Specifically, the problem that we see with injustice. I want to talk about the problems. Now, I want to say this up front as I talk about money, okay? Kingdom economics. I guess I should grab my Bible. Kingdom economics do not fit in conservative or liberal boxes. Okay, I've got my Bible. The things I'm going to be sharing with you, I do my best. I'm a preacher, I'm a Bible teacher, so I do my best to just preach the Bible. And the things that are economically in this book, they don't fit in our conservative liberal boxes. They don't fit in capitalist or socialist boxes, okay? So tonight, as I share these principles, some of them cut against the grain of conservatism, and some of them cut against the grain of liberalism. Some of them cut against the grain of capitalism, and some of them cut against the grain of socialism. And what that tells us is, we don't have a paradigm that really exists in our world that captures the fullness of what God says about money. Because when God talks about economics and the economic system, he's very holistic. It's complex. It requires some nuance. Now, some things are clear, but when God approaches money and economic systems that we're going to talk about tonight, and I get into injustices, it involves a full, holistic approach to it that cuts across. It's not a either or, it's a both and. Okay? And I want to say this. God addresses in the Bible, let me just hold my Bible up just so y'all will know I've got one. God addresses both the powerful, which the powerful are your oppressors. They oppress people with the greed that's in them. All oppression is rooted in greed. Okay, we're going to dive into that deeply tonight. All oppression at some level is rooted in greed. I'd say 99%. Maybe there's some that's just power or control. The majority of oppression is rooted in greed. So God, in the Bible, He addresses the powerful, who are the oppressors. In the Bible, God also addresses the personal, who need personal responsibility. Now, we know that liberals kind of approach things more from the powerful oppressors, and they preach against powerful oppressors. And you know what? God does that too. Okay? And they will preach against systems and structures. And we know that in general, conservatives will preach to personal individuals for personal responsibility. Don't be lazy, have discipline, have a good work ethic, and all the things that personal individuals need to do to be responsible for themselves. Well, guess what? God does too. So God talks about both of those issues. Depending on which part of the Bible you read, it's a little heavier every other way. Tonight, I want to make a point to you, and I want to share something with you, and it's this. So God addresses both sides, okay? But I want you to know God addresses the powerful, in my view, a little more than He does the personal. Now, I'm going to make up some percentages. Let's say it's 60-40. Now, if you read the prophets, it's probably 90% God addressing the powerful who are oppressing people, as opposed to addressing the personal who need to start acting better and being more responsible and work and be self-disciplined and grow and take care of themselves. Like the parable of the talents is a great parable for personal responsibility. God gave 3 different people different amounts, and one person didn't do anything with their talents, which were money. In that parable, it's not skills or ability, it's money. And then God, if you read Proverbs, you think it's mostly about personal responsibility. If you read the prophets, it's mostly about the powerful. But if you take it all, it's something I agree with Tim Keller in his book, Generous Justice. Probably bring that up at the end. He said after studying the issue thoroughly, he became convinced that God spoke more often to the powerful who were oppressing people than He did to the individual who needed to be more responsible. And I agree with that. God would address them. Now, why is that? Why does God address the powerful more often? Simply it's because they have the power. They have the power to actually make change or set change in motion, and to whom much is given, much is required. And if you're powerless, a lot of times if the changes are big picture societal changes, you're helpless to do anything about it if the people in power aren't willing to make those changes. And so God will address the powerful who are bringing oppression. Okay? Now, when God addresses both sides, I use the term greed and envy. Okay? When God addresses the individual who feels envious, they look at what other people have and all the things other people have, and they fill themselves with envy, or they become entitled. And they think that their stuff is my stuff, and they need to give me some of their stuff because I have just as much right to their stuff as they do of theirs. And they get envy. And the Bible addresses this in the 10th commandment, and it's thou shalt not covet, right? And that's a very valid principle, and I will preach many messages on personal responsibility and work and self-discipline and growing up and taking care of yourself and being responsible as an individual. That is as valid a point as any point, right? The other side of the coin, I always use the word greed, because what happens is when you're filled with greed, it causes you to do things or put things in motion. And as we go through tonight, you'll see that cause you to, in the end, oppress other people. Okay? I want to read you something on that topic, because the commandment that deals with greed is thou shalt not steal. So on one hand, you've got, for the individual, don't envy other people's things or covet other people's things. Don't feel entitled like you should be taken care of. But on the bigger picture, God says, thou shalt not steal. Don't let greed cause you to do things. Now, there's something called the Westminster Confessions of Faith. It was written in the early 1600s, and what happened was the Protestants who came out of Catholicism, a few decades later, gathered together and they said, okay, what do we believe now? Whoa, let's figure out what we believe, and let's write down a systemic theology of what we believe about things. It started off with, what is the purpose of man? And just kept going on down. Well, they got to the 8th commandment, and I want to read you what they wrote about the 8th commandment as I hone in on what I'm going to talk about tonight, okay? because I'm setting this up with this foundation. God addresses both sides, but he addresses the oppressor, the powerful, more. So tonight, that's the direction I'm going. And the powerful and the oppressor and the problems that they cause in a society when their greed begins to take them over and they begin to implement things in society that underneath them have a level of greed to them. Okay? I want to read to you what the Westminster Confessions of Faith said about the 8th commandment. The 8th commandment is thou shalt not steal. And listen to what they wrote, and I want you to see what don't steal encompasses and how greed is underlying all of it. I'm just going to read it straight out of the Confessions. These are the sins forbidden by the 8th commandment as they wrote it out as they gathered together. Don't neglect the duties that are required of you, and that would be like a tithe or pay your taxes. Then it says theft, robbery, man-stealing. Did you know that man-stealing, that's what slavery was, they would steal human beings, was addressed in the early 1600s if they would have just listened to thou shalt not steal. That first and foremost meant not human beings, different topic. Receiving anything that's stolen. Then it said this, fraudulent dealings, any fraud was stealing, based in greed. False weights and measures was stealing. Removing landmarks, and all the things that you hear around you about people moving landmarks to steal or to take property from other people or to influence that. Then it lists injustice and unfaithfulness in contracts. They listed in the early 1600s any injustice that you do in contracts that rob people of something that is justly theirs. Then it lists oppression, just as a single word. Any form of oppression is stealing from another human being in some form. It lists extortion. It lists usury. Did you know they said in the Westminster Confessions of Faith that any interest was a sin? Now, other theologians have disagreed with that and said that there's a just level, an okay level, a more balanced, fair level, but any form of usury is expressly forbidden and it's a sin. And we'll get into that. Bribery, unnecessary lawsuits. They even listed when you store up commodities to raise the price, like you try to corner the market on commodities to raise. They listed all that in the early 1600s, and they were all forms of thievery. And what happens is when people in power get in positions of power and they begin to implement forms of injustice and oppression in contracts or fraud or extortion or usury or wages in any way they can to increase their power and wealth or to maintain their power and wealth. And God came and He spoke to the power structures of the day. There was a story I want to share with you as we get going, because what God is concerned about, everybody look at me, just say, what God is concerned about is the extreme. There are always going to be normal distortions, and some have more than others, and some are more successful than others. Some have more gifts, some have more talent, some have more abilities. You're going to have winners and losers, and that's all just the reality of a free market and in a fair system even. You're going to have all that. What God gets upset about and what got the prophets' rage up is when it reached an extreme. God put things in place, and I'll get to this in the second part of this more so than tonight's first part, but God put things in place to try to prevent the extremes. That's what He did. And when oppression and the powerful put things in place to cause extremes to manifest, where things get so extreme and there's such a gap between the wealthy and the poor and the powerful and the powerless, when the gap gets so extreme, that's when God gets upset and says, this is a level of injustice that we just have to do something about. There was a story, and I believe this was in Tim Keller's book, but I'm not sure. It could have been another one that I read on justice. And I can't remember what country this was in, but a man was trying to get his buddy to go to church with him for a long time. And he kept trying to get him to go to church. And finally this guy said, well, I'm going to lose a day's wages if I go to church on Sunday. And finally he broke down and did, and lost a day's wages to go to church on Sunday. And he went to church, and it was a typical Protestant service where the preacher preached on sin. And he talked about temper. He talked about anger. He talked about lust. Talked about all the individual sins that we don't do, addiction or laziness or all the personal individual sin. And then they left the church, and the guy said, so what'd you think about the service today? What'd you think about the sermon? And so the man said, in all honesty and humility, he said, I have all those things. He said, I have anger, and I have lust, and I have battle some addiction, And he went on, he said, I do all those things. So he said, I don't really have anything to say except that I'm guilty of those things. And so the guy said, well, do you think you'll be coming back? And he said, well, I don't think so. And the man said, well, why won't you come back with me? And the man said, because he didn't say anything about the sins of my boss. And he said, you see, my boss, his work conditions, his work wages, his fraudulent dealings with customers, his child labor in that particular culture. And he went down all the list that the managerial power class does to the working class, and he said he talked about my sins, but he didn't talk about the sins of my boss. And I want to say something to you. I believe in most Protestant evangelical churches, we do that. This wasn't in America, I don't believe, if I'm remembering right in the story. It just stuck with me. He didn't talk about the sins of my boss. And sometimes we talk about individual sins in people's lives, but we don't talk about the sins of the system and the structures that we live in that are immoral, that the poor and the working class people are living under, and that they're feeling the weight under, and that are doing injustices to them. And we don't necessarily speak to the power structure. So this first one, the second one's going to be on solutions, but tonight on this first one I'm doing on economics, this is one for the boss. Okay? And rather than deal with personal individual, there'll be other times I speak to personal individual that they need to work, they need to have discipline, they need to not be lazy, don't be entitled, be responsible. Deal with all that. Those are messages I've done many times. But tonight, I want to deal with specifically issues that deal with, this is one for the boss. This is one for the powerful who have the power to set laws and pass, financial guidelines in place and put things in place that all the rest of the people in the world just have to live with. So as I go through these, I'm going to give you 5 things. I'm just going to point out 5 things from Scripture that were in the Old Testament, stories and things that God said, and I'm going to try to make application to something in our day that it applies to, and let you just chew on it, okay? A lot of you, I'll give you this disclaimer, some of you are going to disagree with what I say tonight. Some of the things I say. Now, if you do, you're wrong. I'm just joking. But you'll probably disagree in some ways. But think about it. Okay? I want you to think about the things I'm saying tonight in the context of injustice and in the context of how the powerful can oppress or put things in, even if they're innocent. Let's don't question motives. Even if let's say it's not just greed. Some of it's greed, to be honest with you. A lot of it is, in my opinion. Let's say even if they're innocent and their intentions, they don't realize it. We're putting things in place that have an extra burden on the poor. So let me pray over that, and then I'm going to dive in and just bring up 5 things, 5 thoughts, and apply them to our day and talk about it with you that I want us to consider as we think about injustice and economics. Okay? So Father, I pray that what I say is clear. I pray that it causes our heart to open to injustice and the reality of injustice on a systemic level, on a law level, how the policies and implementations of governments, banks, even in the capitalist system. Because God, something I'll say tonight a lot, some may call greed capitalism, but you call greed sin. And God, I'm going to say that again. Greed isn't capitalism. Greed is sin. And some people exalt greed as a virtue. And tonight I'm going to destroy it as a sin. And God, that's your heart, because greed is at the root of most oppression, including slavery. It was at the root of slavery. They wanted cheap labor, free labor. So God, I pray that tonight I would destroy the spirit of greed in what I say. And I pray that it convicts us, and I pray that it opens our eyes to think about even what else in our system is unnecessarily causing undue injustice on the poor. And I pray for that in Jesus' name. All right, are you ready? Number 1, let's dive into these 5 things, okay? Because the Bible puts the emphasis on the powerful, the prophets sure do. Let's talk about unjust laws. Just straight up unjust laws. Isaiah 10, 1 through 3 says this, and I want to read it to you. Let me get to it. Okay, woe to those who make unjust laws. Isn't that complicated? Isaiah 10, 1 through 3. Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights. They withhold justice for the oppressed of my people. They make widows their prey, robbing the fatherless, What will you do, God says, in the day of reckoning? Now, there's our list again. That's not one I included last week when I talked about vulnerables, but every time injustice comes up, it comes up in the reality of the list of vulnerables that God has. But it says, woe to you who make unjust laws and give unjust decrees that oppress the widow, the fatherless, and the orphan, and the vulnerable. Unjust laws. I want to make a point that there have been many times in history where things have been legal, but they've been immoral. You understand the difference in the two of those, right? Legality and morality are not the same thing, right? I'm going to make an extreme statement just to prove that point. Everything Hitler did was legal. In Germany, every single thing there was nothing Hitler did that was illegal in Germany. As shocking as that may seem, they passed laws okaying everything they did before they did it. Slavery was legal, wasn't it? But it was immoral until it was overturned and outlawed. It was always immoral. Then it finally became illegal. Abortion is legal today, but it's immoral. So what's legal is not the same thing as what's moral. So just because there is a law doesn't mean that it's a just law. So when God comes down, and I want to say this to you, it is a helpless thing to be powerless. When you're a minority or you're in a helpless situation and you're totally helpless and the powerful have all control over everything and you're powerless down here and they're making the laws and they're setting the structures in place and you're powerless, it's a helpless thing, and that's why God speaks to the powerful who are making the unjust laws and setting them in place. Now, a lot of times I will make jokes like the great theologian Mariah Carey or the great theologian, and then name a music group or whatever, and then quote a song that they did or a song that they sang. Well, tonight's great theologian that I'm going to quote is Brad Pitt. And I'm going to quote to you Brad Pitt, what he said in the movie, the great theologian, my favorite theologian, got to be the best looking theologian of all time, right? Brad Pitt. But in the movie 12 Years a Slave, I want to read to you what Brad Pitt said when he was talking to a slave owner. They were working on a house, and Brad Pitt in the movie, I can't remember his character in the movie, or I just refer to the name, he said this to the slave owner as they're working on the house. He said, "There is no justice nor righteousness in this slavery. What right have you to your slaves?" And the man said, "Well, I bought them and I paid for them." And Brad said, "Of course you did. And the law," if we were in person, I'd say, "and the law," and you say the law, says you have the right to hold a slave. And then Brad said this, "But begging the law's pardon, it lies." I want to say that again. Begging the law's pardon, it lies. Suppose they pass a law to take away your liberty. Suppose they make you a slave. After all, laws change. He said, universal truths, though, are constant. And I want to say that again. After all, laws change. But he said universal truths. I think somebody read the Bible who wrote this line because they quoted justice and righteousness in this little paragraph Brad read. But he said universal truths are constant. It is a fact, plain and simple, that what is true and right is true and right for all. I'm going to say that again. What's true and right is true and right for all. I'm only asking, listen, this is in the movie 12 Years a Slave. And he said, I'm only asking in the eyes of God, what is the difference? And he goes on to talk about there being a day of reckoning, which Isaiah 10 did as well, when he said, for those who make unjust laws, what will they do in the days of reckoning? And I want to make this point that universal truths and morality are constant and they don't change. Men may go up and down with laws that are unjust and they may change. But God's moral, absolute, constant truths never change. And so when there are unjust laws, it is up to men to preach righteousness and justice until those laws align themselves with morality. And I'll give you an example from the past, and then I want to give you an example in the current day that I bet 99% of you have not thought of. Okay? In the past, I want to talk about redlining. Now, I don't think anybody in our culture has ever experienced what the black community in America has experienced, from slavery through Jim Crow segregation, through something called redlining, and on down the line. Redlining was something that the banking institutions and the crediting institutions and the authorities put in place that said they zoned neighborhoods according to a color code, from green to the best to blue to yellow. Well, if you were zoned as a red neighborhood, if there was a red line drawn around your neighborhood, you were deemed hazardous and unworthy of credit. Now watch what happened. An individual in the neighborhood could have qualified for credit, but the neighborhood was zoned as unworthy of credit. So many individuals in the neighborhoods that were deemed were qualified and worthy of credit, but they couldn't get credit because they were in a hazardous neighborhood. And during those decades, this was outlawed 50 years ago. The law was changed and it was brought back. But the decades that redlining was put in place, those neighborhoods could not develop. They could not advance. They could not progress. Statistically, 3 out of 4 of those neighborhoods, 80 years later, years and years and years later, 80% of those neighborhoods are still struggling. So when you see neighborhoods and you see circumstances that are like they are, in certain situations, a huge part of that is because redlining was put in place decades ago, and the consequences of that still overflow today and have affected that community today because they could not get on the right side of progress and advancement and move on. That's just one example of the past of how an unjust law causes generational damage in certain situations. Now I want to bring up a topic. I'm going to bring up one topic under each of these 5 things. The first one is unjust laws. And I want you to think about the possibility that this is unjust, what I'm about to say. And I don't think we think about it. Just think about it. And the topic is bail bond, money bail. There was a vet. I could give you thousands of stories like this. I read many of them as I read about justice. There was a vet. I want to look up his name just so I validate it. His name was Richard Stanford. And he got arrested for trespassing. I can't remember what the situation was, but he got arrested for trespassing. This Vietnam vet had, a couple of bucks to his name. So he was brought in, and they put a bail on him of $2,600. He had a couple of bucks. The bail's $2,600. He's in jail because he can't bail himself out. He hasn't had a day in court yet. He hasn't been convicted of a crime. But he's in jail. And he's stuck in jail because he has no money to get out. He stays in jail for a week. He stays in jail for another week. He stays in jail for another week. Weeks and weeks went on until Richard Stanton finally reached a point of he didn't believe he was guilty, but he finally said, I'll just tell him I'm guilty so I can get out of here. And he did. And in the end, his time while he was held waiting for the trial served as a time of punishment more than it would have been. And our system is upside down in this way. Now, if you have money, if you have wealth, you are able to pay your bail and get out. Now watch me. If you're poor and you cannot pay your bail and you're stuck in prison, here are some of the consequences that happen to you if you're in there. See, if you have money, it's an annoying thing. But if you don't have money, it destroys your life. And while they're in jail, people who are poor and can't pay their bail, now we're not talking about dangerous criminals. There are some legislation being put in place in many states right now to change this system, by the way, to address it and try to deal with it. Okay? And the reality is that if you're stuck in jail and you can't pay your bail, you lose your job because you can't go to work. Then you lose your home, your car, because you can't make your payments. Then your family suffers because you can't be there to take care of your family. Then you can't buy basic needs because you're trying to raise money to pay for bail. And as bail goes on right now, I'm going to give you just a couple of statistics just to begin to think about. There are hundreds of thousands of people that are in jail right now who can't pay their bail, have never had their day in court. Many of them will be proven to be innocent. But they're in jail because they can't pay bail, because that's the way we set bail. We set this to determine whether someone is in jail until their court day or they're out. Most legislation offers this simple solution that you don't get punished before your trial. You get punished if you don't show up for your trial. That if you don't show up for most of these people are not dangerous and they just need to wait till their court date. And if the legislation says if they just don't show up to their court date, then there's an issue for their arrest and then they go to jail. Makes a little sense, doesn't it? But guess what? There's a tens of billions of dollar industry called bail money. If you Google the top 10 unjust laws, I can promise you bail money will be near the top. It could be number one if you just Google it. That bail money, the system of how we do that, we have got to rethink, because whether you agree with it, with bail money, whether you don't agree with it, and that's fine, there's an argument to be had on either side. You can't argue the fact that it punishes the poor much more. That if people have means, they can pay the bail and be annoyed that they had to pay it. But if they don't have money, it devastates their lives and causes a spiral as the fines build and the fees build and the things build, and they lose literally their job, their car, their family suffers because they just didn't have enough money. We should be able to, everybody look at me for this, we should be able to come up with a justice system that doesn't punish people for being poor, it punishes people for their behavior. And whether you agree with bail money or not, who benefits from bail money? Well, obviously the bondsman and the fees. I read where in Maryland alone, I think it was a year, there was $250 million in fees and premiums and all the things that are involved. We're talking tens of billions of dollars get funded in bail money. And the fees and the premiums and the expenses on that. Can I say that some of the things that are done to desperate people in those poor situations are unjust? We're talking about justice, and the fees and the premiums and the expenses in a desperate situation that are done to poor and desperate people. It's unjust, and it starts a spiral of debt that causes them to cycle out of control. And I want to read this to you. It's my bottom line as I thought about this point. The wealthy can buy pretrial freedom. They can keep their job and live at home. The poor will stay in jail for days, weeks, months. Pre-trial, they'll lose their jobs, their homes, and they'll be unable to care for their family. It does nothing to promote liberty or safety or court appearance rates. It doesn't change the court appearance rates at all, they found statistically. It digs a hole for the poor they can't get out of, is what it does. It causes, and even people who are innocent end up having this hole that's been dug for them because they are poor and because they are suffering. Statistically, 1/5 of the jail population, around 450,000, are waiting trial because they can't pay bail. Think about the cost on our system. That 1/5 of those in jail statistically are there because they can't pay bail, and the taxpayer is having to pay for their care and their food and their upkeep. They would rather be out, and it would save us money, and they should just be punished if they don't show up to court. It's just a thought. Just think about how the bail money system, but it's going to be hard to challenge. Do you know why? Because now greed's in there. Because it's a huge, huge money industry, and there's huge premiums and fees that get put on it. But there's some injustice there. You can't argue. Let's say there's even a right way to do a bail system. You can't argue that punishes the poor more than it does the wealthy. Let's go to number 2. So the first one was unjust laws. The second one is exploitation of the poor by those in power. Exploitation of the poor by those in power. I want to tell you a story from the Bible, and many of you will know it. Some of you will be very familiar with it. It's the story of Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab and Jezebel were a king in Israel, and they reached a point in this one moment that I'm going to talk about. It's in 1 Kings. Which chapter is it? 2 Kings 21. And they wanted this vineyard. There was this choice piece of land that they wanted from this dude named Naboth. And Naboth had this vineyard. It was awesome. I mean, it was awesome. Produced some of the best grapes and wine and everything of that day. And they wanted it, but Naboth didn't want to sell it to them. Naboth wanted to keep his vineyard. Do you know why he wanted to keep his vineyard? Because the Bible says it was his family. Saying it in our simple language, it was family property. It was family land. So he didn't want to give up family land. It was his ancestors' land. It was his heritage. And he wanted to keep the family land. But the people in power, the king, and the queen, Ahab, Jezebel, they wanted his land. And to them, he was a peon, just an average person out there. And who is he to tell the king and the queen that they can't have his land, even though it was his family's land? So the powerful came up with a strategy. Jezebel did it, came up with a strategy to go have elders in his city, in Naboth's city, falsely accuse him of a crime and put him to death. So they did. She told the elders what to do. The elders accused him of a crime he didn't commit. It was unjust. They put him to death. Ahab and Jezebel went and took possession of Naboth's vineyard. It was a form of land banishment, taking land away from someone because powerful people want the land. Land banishment, exploiting the poor. We wouldn't have a problem with that in our culture ever, would we? Where powerful people, either money people, corporations, whoever it is, where powerful people, they want land from someone to develop it or do something with it, but the person doesn't want to give it to them. Would anybody ever think that that would be possible, where people would have land banishment? Well, they do. There are wealth banishment laws in certain parts of areas, and I know there are arguments on both sides of this, and there are certain times where there's good laws to have qualifications of water and sewage and all the basic things that need to be. There are good laws in those areas, I understand that, but there are some that get put in place, and what they do is they say any home that's below this certain arbitrary value, and they set a value, any home that is under that value, you can no longer keep and it can no longer stay there, because they want to take the land and develop the land and do something with the land. And you will hear of very wealthy, powerful people filing lawsuits and doing things to cause people to be removed from their land, to exploit them from their land. And there are people who would argue for the development side of that, and people that would argue for the protection of private property side of that. It's going to be hard to get me to go against private property if an individual's had that land in their family for all those years. And God's heart would be to try to help the poor person try to protect their land or keep their land. There may be rare exceptions to that, but in general, that's the truth. Nonetheless, there are laws, there are movements, there are things, there are pressures that get put in place when powerful people want land for a purpose, and powerless or helpless or regular people want to keep the land because it's family land or it's their land. And so many times we see the powerful oppress the powerless, the poor, and take things away from them. And in the end, many times they take away the only modest home that powerless person or that poor person has. And when God looks at that, He sees injustice. Remember, God's the God of the vulnerable. God is the God of the widow, the orphan, the fatherless, and the poor, the sojourner, and the immigrant. We talked about that in depth in the last two messages. God is a God who's with the poor, and God's heart, and I'll get into this in the next message, God's heart is to look at the poor and help them not be poor. It's not to drive them off what little they have. It's to help them grow and not be poor anymore and develop and bring them up. It's not to push them out. It's to lift them up. We do so many things like that in our set. I shouldn't say so many, but we do things like that in our studying where powerful people, they may call it capitalism. God calls it sin. And God calls it injustice. Now that may challenge you, but I'm just telling you, greed is not capitalism. It's sin. They may call it capitalism, but God calls greed sin. And again, I'll get into this deeper as we go along and talk about greed specifically. I'm going to read what I wrote at the bottom line of this point as well, because at the end of these points, I tend to just kind of bottom line it the way I like to. We have to come up with a justice system in any system. We should find ways to do things that don't punish people for being poor, specifically because they are poor in a disproportionate way. Ways that don't benefit the wealthy. Even if you agree with some of the policies and the ways, that's fine, that's a fair argument, because the how of a lot of this is not in the Bible. These are principles that are in the Bible. How we work that out in real life, those are real discussions that we have to kind of figure out how to do some of this. But even if you agree with some of the policies, there's no argument it burdens the poor disproportionately. And we need to implement policies and structures that punish behavior, not economic condition. That's the bottom line. And the reality is, whether it's unjust laws in the bail bond system or whether it's exploitation of the poor and banishment from land, just like Ahab and Jezebel did. And I'm just throwing out one example. There are dozens of these examples. I'm just trying to make you think that the policies, the structures, the laws we put in place, they have impact on real people, and God sees the poor. God is with the poor. He's there. And He tends to probably take the side and would tell the powerful, hey, well, instead of taking what they have away, why don't you help them grow and develop out of that until they're not poor anymore? Well, let's go to another one, and these will become even more clear as I walk through this. Number 3, unjust lending practices. Unjust lending practices. The first one was just unjust laws. Second one was when you just exploit the poor because you have power and you're able to, through mechanisms, laws, and pressures, remove them from things or take things away from them. The third thing is unjust lending practices. Now, it may surprise you to know that God talked about lending practices in the Bible. In the book of Deuteronomy, He said, when you take collateral for a loan, when you give a loan, and watch this, when you give a loan and you take a pledge against it, and He laid several things down for how it would be fair to do that. And watch God's heart. God's heart always leans toward the poor person and the helpless person. Watch God's heart and how He said loans needed to be set up. When you take a loan, give a loan, you take a pledge against it, He said this, because it was a little bit more of just kind of a community situation. He said, don't go into their house when they're getting their pledge. They would give them a pledge of something from their house as an earnest or a guarantee that they would pay the loan back. And so the one giving the loan would keep it until the other person paid the loan, then they would give them back the pledge. So God said, look, respect them, respect their house. Don't go in their house when they're getting their pledge. You wait outside the house, and you let them bring their pledge to you. And then He said this, now watch me. He said, if it's a poor person, don't keep, for instance, they would give their coat or their cloak as the pledge for the loan. And He said, if it's a poor person, don't keep their cloak overnight. Don't keep their coat overnight because they're poor and it's cold and they have need of it. So even though they technically could have kept their coat as pledge for the loan, they didn't get payment for the loan, and God just said, give them their pledge back. It'll be okay. God's heart was that the poor be cared for, that the poor be to have mercy and compassion on the poor. Most of the time in loan situations, it's the people that don't need a loan that have an easy time getting a loan. And if you need a loan, you have trouble getting a loan because you don't have collateral to get a loan. And God was saying, even though this poor person who needs a loan doesn't have the collateral that he needs to get a loan, don't take away the very few things they have because they actually need them, and just help them with the loan, was God's heart. And I know there's a total counter argument for that, and you can get irresponsible on the other end of that with people who are entitled and demanding and full of envy, and that's a full discussion and a message on the other side. But God's heart with good people, with generally good people who are going to pay, instead of being harsh with them, instead of being hard with them, just don't take away what few things they have and keep them away from them while they're suffering. They need everything they have, so don't take it from them, and set up, the principle we can learn from that is, don't set up the terms of a loan in a way that are harsh and hard on poor people, on people in general. Don't be that way. Don't set up those terms. But God cared about how the loan was set up and how the loan would be developed. That the collateral for the loan and that the terms of the loan would not be overbearing. Unjust lending practices. Unjust lending practices. I'm going to read this. I was going to give you the illustration, the issue that I was going to bring up, but I'm going to read this. Predatory lending. Okay? Listen to what predatory lending is. Any practice that imposes unfair, abusive terms. Remember, God's heart was basically, don't put terms on the loan that are so abusive that it causes harm to the other person. The definition of predatory lending is imposes unfair and abusive terms on the borrower that are being deceptive, coercive, exploitive, or unscrupulous. Don't burden them with such unscrupulous lending practices and terms that you in the end cause harm to the poor person that you look like you're trying to help. About 15 years ago, we had a housing crisis. It was the economic crisis, the great financial crisis, they call it, in 07, 08. It was a housing boom and a housing crisis that caused that. And you know what was underneath that? Underneath this great housing crisis of 07 and 08? Unjust lending practices. There was a huge argument during those days. Is it the person who took out these loans? There were mansions going up everywhere. You may remember them. It was like the real estate went crazy. You could get loans for anything. They would give you loans for more than the value of a lot of houses, of your house in a lot of cases. I mean, they were just handing out mortgages like candy for people who really didn't qualify for mortgages. And in the end, the poor people who really couldn't afford the mortgages, and many people were coming down on the poor people or the people who couldn't afford the loans. And they were saying they should have been responsible. They should have read the contract, because what ended up happening is the poor people got in way over their head in things they couldn't pay. And not only did they lose their money trying to pay the debt, they ended up losing the property, and the banks and the companies seized the property back from them that they got. And people said, well, they should have, the personal responsibility people, and there's a truth on that side, were responsible to read it, understand. They should have known they made the mistake. They made their bed. They're going to have to lie in it. On the other side, you had people coming after the powerful people, and that they were saying the powerful people knew what they were doing. The powerful people who set these structures up and they were handing out these loans, they were selling the loans. They were selling them. They were coercing people. They were manipulating people. They were trying to promise them the moon. You can have one of these McMansions. You can have this house. You can have, and it can be yours too. And the poorer people, or the lower middle class people, were just trying, oh my gosh, I can qualify for one of those. They really couldn't, but they sold it to them as they could. And the people who were selling the mortgage, and even in the banking system, the mortgage-backed securities that were being passed on, I'm going to tell you something. Everybody look at me. They knew what they were doing. They knew the people didn't qualify for those loans. They knew it. They absolutely knew it shouldn't be taking place. So I draw a distinction, and I put more onus on the people who knew what they were doing, as opposed to the people, they're both responsible, but this person down here didn't really understand what they were doing, got in over their head, and in the end lost. This person knew what they were doing, and they sold it to them anyway, knowing this person couldn't afford it and probably couldn't pay for it. You know why they did it? Greed. Because the people making those sales started making thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, even on Wall Street in the banking system. This in the end caused Lehman, the bank, to fail and go out of business. Made movies about it. Greed. Everybody look at me. Greed. It's a monster. And these people, what they were doing to poor people who couldn't really afford these loans, to put them in bondage of debt, and in the end they lost their property and their money, and everything came tumbling down on them. In the end, it was greed that caused them to do injustice and oppress those people, because they just couldn't turn it off, because the money that was coming in was overwhelming them, and they just couldn't say no, because greed got a hold of their heart. And in the end, greed destroys. They may have called it capitalism, but God calls it sin, because greed is not capitalism. And again, I'm going to get to that as we move along. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But God calls greed sin. Many people on Wall Street call greed capitalism. God calls greed sin. Well, let's go to another one. Number 4 is usury. Excess interest. My favorite story, I'll read you a verse of scripture on this one just directly. This is pretty blunt, and it's pretty straightforward. Exodus 22:25. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not charge him interest. Is that clear? If you lend money to my people, the people among you, you shall not charge him interest. My favorite story, probably need my journal and my notes for this, is Nehemiah 5. God's people have been captive in Babylon for 70 years. Everybody look at me as I describe this, because this is the heart of man right here. This is how mankind is. God's people are in Babylon for 70 years. They finally get out. Nehemiah is bringing the remnant of Israel back to rebuild the walls. And there have been many sermons preached about the rebuilding of the walls, and Nehemiah leading the charge to rebuild the walls. By the time they get to Nehemiah chapter 5, the people of Israel are already filled with greed and already oppressing their brothers and sisters. And chapter 5 is filled with economic things, very economic system things that the powerful are already doing to the powerless, and how they're oppressing them. But the chief among them all was usury, and how they were exacting usury and excess interest on their brothers and sisters. And Nehemiah just went crazy. He just went totally berserk. This is by the time he gets to verse 7, it says, Nehemiah was angry, and he said, you are exacting usury each from his brother. And in verse 8, he says this, we were redeemed from bondage. Now would you even sell them to us So we're in bondage again. And he said likewise, verse 10, likewise, I, my brothers and servants, are lending them money and grain. Please let us leave off the usury. Nehemiah begs them, please let us use off the usury. When you loan to your brother or sister, get a pledge, like it said in Deuteronomy. And if that's too oppressive, don't even keep the pledge. But the last thing we want to do is be charging people usury and excess interest. And verse 11 says this, if you've done this, give back to them the land and the fields and the vineyards and the part of the money and the grain you are extracting from them in the interest. He said, give it back. If you've taken interest and you've extracted from them in interest, I want you to give it back. And he came in and corrected it. They couldn't stand the fact that they had an opportunity to increase and not charge interest exorbitantly. I remember years ago I had a man in town and we were talking about some of these things. And I was telling him one of my ideas, and I said, the thing is, if we could get some people together and have a fund developed so that when people had a time and their refrigerator goes out or their washer and dryer goes out and they need a short loan to help them get a washer and dryer that they're going to pay back, talking about good people in the church community, and we could just have a pool together that we could give it to them and they didn't get charged interest on it. They just borrow it like from a family member and then they could pay it back in the fund, and we could have a fund like that. And he said, I know. He said, it's a contrary thought that people would think the thought that we shouldn't charge interest to one another because it's just become so ingrained in our system. And theologians have disagreed. I read to you Westminster Confessions of Faith thought any interest was a sin, okay, on your brothers and sisters. Others like Calvin and others thought there were fair rates that could be done. And so let's just opt for the average, just that they're fair rates, and let's don't get exorbitant. You and I both know in our day, like Nehemiah got outraged at them charging undue interest. We know there are loan sharks. We know there are quick, short day loans, and people who are in need, who are poor, who get in desperate situations. There are these setups that they can go to get these loans, but they get charged 12, 15, 18, 22% interest to get these $500 loans, and they get in. And yes, you can come down on the individual for not being personally responsible and having a budget and developing work ethic and seeking it. You can get it. You can do that, and that's a fair argument. But I'm telling you also on the other side, we don't talk enough about the fact that from a systemic level, it is injustice and it is greed to exert usury on another human being like that. Maybe there's a fair level, but there's also a wrong level, and we see the wrong level done all the time. So the one I want to pull out for this illustration in our day is a simple one that everybody's very familiar with. This example is credit cards. Did you know that credit cards didn't start until the 70s? How many of you know we didn't have credit cards until the 70s? Things changed in the 70s. We disconnected from the gold standard. Money began to be treated differently and began to be inflated. Our currency began to be inflated differently, and we began to increase debt drastically after that era. You'll watch the debt charts of the United States in debt. Part of the underlying part of the debt cycle that began to develop in our country is credit cards. And I want to say something to you when we talk about credit cards. And credit cards are fine. I'm not against credit cards or for credit. That's not my point. I'm against usury. Talking about usury, there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And I know somebody's already telling me, well, if you just pay your bill every month, you won't have any interest. I know. Given all of that, credit cards, you may not know that because there are usury laws in every state. Did you know that? Oklahoma has a usury limit. Every state has a usury limit. Some are around 10, some are around 8, some are around 6%. But unfortunately, big banks, institutions, and credit cards are exempt from those laws. And there is no limit, you may not know this, there is no limit to the interest that a credit card company can charge you in interest. Legally, there's no limit. There was the example of two individuals who had paid on time, who had not ever done anything wrong. Suddenly they got a notice that their rates had changed from 7% to 23%. I could give you several different stories like this. That the credit card company, without warning, this is in the past, their credit card company, without warning, without notice, changed their interest rate from 7 to 8% to 23 to 24% interest just without notice. And they can do that if they want to do that. Now, most of the time, they probably won't do that, shouldn't do that. If you pay on time, you're a good customer. But they can. There was a Credit Card Act law, I think it was 2009, 2010, where they put in place some guidelines to try to tamp this down. And they said things like the credit card company has to give you 45 days notice before they raise your rates so you can deal with it, have to at least give you 40. Nice of them, huh? But in the middle, and credit card companies, by the way, if you had a past balance, they not only could raise your rate on future things you bought, they could raise the rate on your past balance. Before this credit card act that changed that said now they have to give you notice, and now they can only raise your rates on things going forward. But in the credit card act, they didn't change the fact that there is no limit on the amount of interest that a credit card company can charge you. I'm going to say something that I've said throughout this with all the love I can in my heart, because probably everybody I know has credit cards, and that's great. That has nothing to do with what I'm saying. There's a right way to do credit cards, and there's a wrong way to do credit. There's a right way to do everything. I'm not for or against anything except usury. And they may call greed capitalism as they squeeze more money out, and they're getting wealthy. Everybody knows Einstein said compound interest was the eighth wonder of the world. God knew that before Einstein. And powerful people and wealthy people know getting on the right side of interest and compounding interest is how they can get extremely wealthy. And greed is behind that. And they may call greed capitalism. There's an honest, fair form of free markets where we operate in free markets, in the competitive free marketplace. And I'm all for that. I want freedom. I want absolute freedom. Totally against socialism, but I'm hitting a little bit on capitalism tonight, kind of punching on it a little bit, because our form of capitalism is filled with greed. And they may call greed capitalism. Just a part of capitalism, baby. It's just part of it. But God calls greed sin. And usury is a sin. It's clearly listed in the Bible. There can be many theologians say there's a fair interest rate. There's a fair point. That's fair. But there's also an unfair and an unjust that oppresses people, and it makes it impossible for them to get ahead or get out. I'll tell you a quick story about that. I remember years ago, I was studying the kingdom, understood the kingdom, and I began to get a vision for what the church was supposed to be. And I got a vision, some of you are going to laugh at this thought, but I wanted to have a vision that our church, that there would be churches, and that there would be church that were kingdom-minded, that had banks as a part of their mission. And I thought, well, I can't be the first person to have ever had this vision or think of it, so I started looking, are there any churches out there that have set up banks? So instead of all of God's people storing their money in secular banks and secular institutions, building up wealth for secular heathens, and they're collecting all of our interest as it compounds and compounds and compounds, that our money can be kept in the kingdom and it can be used to build the kingdom and help the poor and the needy and the orphans. So I thought we should have our own banks where our money's kept in our own banks with godly men, godly women running these banking institutions. And I found a church that had one, fully developed. So a group of us got together, we hopped in the car, we headed off to the city to check out this bank. Now it was formed as a credit union, but you get up to the church, big church, called Grace Church in the city we went to, and a portion of the building off to the side was the banking portion of their deal. And they had drive-through teller, just like you would at a bank. They would drive through to the teller and put your deal in the deal, and it was just a bank. They formalized it as a credit union, and in this credit union, it was called Grace Credit Union at this church, and all of the thousands of people that were members of this church, and even others, I'm sure, that wanted to be a part of it to build the kingdom of God, kept their money in the credit union that was a portion or a branch of this church, and in so doing, they had pools of money that would just help people with no interest. And then they would have typical loans and things that would function like a normal credit union, but it was done fair, and it was done just, and it was done righteously so that no one was oppressed. Now I want to say something to you. I would love it, just in my heart and my vision, if churches all over America had a kingdom vision and had godly men and godly women with the skill and the knowledge and the experience to know how to do that correctly. And it takes just the right people to do stuff like that. Would set those. And when we talk about the fourth turning, I feel the Lord all of a sudden. When we talk about the fourth turning and systems changing and structures changing, this is the kind of stuff that needs to be going off in people's heart. That there are those of you out there that are going to rise up and you're going to be a part of this systemic change so that the kingdom of God can begin to function in these kind of areas so that godliness and justice and righteousness. I believe there are people out there that are going to hear this, and it's going to spark something in you that maybe you'll raise a credit union that's righteous and just, and it's filled with the principles of God to care for the poor, help the poor. And I think God would honor it, and God's people would have a place to store their money that builds the kingdom and takes care of the poor at the same time. All kinds of ideas and all kinds of systems, but that's just one. Well, let's move on. That was usury. So we went through unjust laws. We went through exploitation, land banishment, just one of many examples. We went through lending practices. We went through usury. I'm going to give you one more, and then let's bring this home. And the last one is unjust wages. Did you know that in the Bible, God cares about wages? Listen to this verse, Deuteronomy 24, 14 through 15. You shall not oppress your hired servants who is poor. I'm going to read that again. You shall not oppress hired servants who are poor and needy. You shall give him his wages before the sun sets, for he is poor, and his heart is set on it. In other words, he doesn't have anything. Give him his wages before he goes home because he doesn't have any other way to function or live. I want to say this to you, and everybody look at me. God cares how you pay people. Did you know that? Inflation in our culture is okay until it hits wages, and then they start shutting it down. I want to read you a couple of statistics. I had to use my journal for this. Since 1965, listen to this. Since 1965, CEO compensations have gone up 312 times the annual average. They're 312 times what they were in 1965. Workers' compensation has gone up 20 times. Since 1965, CEO compensation has gone up 312 times what it was then. Worker compensation has only gone up 20 times. CEO growth and compensation, and another survey said, has gone up 1,322%. Worker compensation has gone up 18%. You see, it's the extremes that gets God upset. On an inflation-adjusted wage basis, we're declining right now at the fastest rate we have in decades. It's the extremes that get God upset, and I want to say that again. It's the extremes, it's the extremes, it's the extremes. There's always going to be disproportionate, and by the way, a CEO should make a lot more than a worker because of their skill set, just like the parable of the talents. Skill set, talents, workload, all that's involved in that, they should make. There's a proportionate level that's involved there, but when it gets so disproportionate, I'll get into this a little bit again in the next message. When it gets so extreme, that gets God upset. It gets God frustrated that there's not more of a sharing in the profits or the increase of what's coming in. God cares about the wages that are there. I'm going to read this to you, another stat. In 2012, listen to these wealthy people, and you'll recognize their names. Elon Musk in 2012 had $2 billion. Now he's got $260 billion. This is how much wealthy assets have increased during that time. And then I want to shock you with what's true about our wages. Jeff Bezos had $18 billion in 2012. Now he's got $180 billion. Bill Gates had $61 billion. Now, I'm not against anybody having anything. I just want things to be fair and just. Now he's got $133 billion. Warren Buffett had $44 billion. And in 2022, he's got $125 billion. Now watch me. The minimum wage. In 2009, the minimum wage was $7.25. This is the federal minimum wage. In 2022, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. And the reality of that is, and there are great financial arguments on each side of this, but the bottom line on this is, in our system, and again, next message as I get into solutions, and I hate to keep teaching you that way, but I can't get into everything at once. The way our system is done, we keep inflating things, and we love it when assets go up, real estate prices, stock prices, all the prices of our assets. But the minute wages begin going up, everybody freaks out, because when wages go up, that's when inflation is kicking into the system, and we have an inflationary problem. So they don't want wages to go up, they want assets to go up. What that means is the rich get way richer, and the poor down here just barely ticking along, and this gap just keeps getting larger and larger because because when wages go up, it means inflation is getting sticky. And it's going to stick because once you raise wages, you don't usually bring wages back down. You can kind of get prices back down, but it's hard to get wages back down. So they don't want that. So they actually fight against wage increases because it causes inflation in the system to get sticky, the cost push inflation that comes about. It's hotly debated. All I want to say to you is God cares about how you pay people. And God cares whether you share the increase of the profits with people. And in America, we tend to be, in our greedy capitalism, we want to squeeze every last ounce of profit out. And squeeze it and squeeze it and squeeze it, instead of sharing the profits with our workers. And God cares how you pay your workers. God cares how you take care of them. I'll just read to you my bottom line on this point. When profits of the wealthy owners increase, but it isn't shared with the labor and the worker, it's unjust and not giving them their due portion. And I'll say it one last time. They may call greed capitalism. It's just part of capitalism. God calls greed sin. And whether it's unjust wages, unjust lending practices, usury, exploitation of the poor, or unjust laws to exploit the poor, God calls it injustice, and God calls greed sin. There's a point to be made right here about taxation. I talked about capitalist exploitation and unjustness. There's a fair point to be made about socialistic ideas where taxation from a big government is one of the most oppressive things we have, taking all our taxes away. I'm not partial. I'm impartial. Capitalism, socialism, we have no idea how unfree we are, how lack of freedom we have when it comes to economic freedom, because we're oppressed and pulled on from every direction. Capitalist greed, socialistic policies and power, everybody's trying to get from us. And we have no idea how our freedoms economically have been stripped away from us. So let's hit the monster. Okay, give me 5 more minutes to just punch the monster in the mouth. The undercurrent of everything I've said about the problems that are there, and there are others and many more that we can name and go into, but I just tried to pick 5 to show you that are biblical examples and then apply them to our day. The monster under the surface is greed. It's greed. And everybody give me this. Give me your full attention on this, okay? As a young man, I was 18, 19, 20 years old, and there was a preacher named Larry Lee, and some of you will remember who Larry Lee is, and some of you will have never heard of Larry Lee. Larry Lee started a national prayer movement. He had hundreds of thousands of people all over the nation praying the Lord's Prayer for an hour a day. And he taught people how to pray through the Lord's Prayer. He actually learned it from Young-E Cho over in Korea, but that's another story. And he taught people how to pray the Lord's Prayer every day. And we would try to pray the Lord's Prayer, and there were a bunch of us all over the nation praying the Lord's Prayer. And I remember being at a prayer event, and Larry Lee shared this story. And he shared the story of how MacArthur had come back from World War II after we won World War II and defeated the enemies of that war. And he told America, send every missionary you've got to Japan because they're ripe to hear the gospel right now. And he said America didn't respond. America was too caught up in materialism and too caught up in selfishness and too caught up in greed to send any ministers to Japan. And he said the Lord spoke to him in that hour and said that greed and a spirit of greed and a principality of greed was one of the top 3 principalities that needed to be dealt with in America for God to bring awakening and revival to America, because greed had taken us over. There's a woman that I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, but hey, I've been in trouble before, and I'm gonna get in trouble again. There's a woman that many conservatives love to quote, and her name is Ayn Rand. And she wrote a book called Atlas Shrugged. It has some really good economic principles in it from an economic system. But everybody look at me. Ayn Rand was an atheist philosophically. And this is where some of this comes from at its root. And Ayn Rand had a philosophy that said greed is good because it motivates you to work hard in everything that's in your self-interest. She called it something about your ego. I can't remember the term. But she believed greed was good because she was philosophically an atheist. So she believed in free market economy, but from a philosophy of atheism and greed, because greed promotes you to work and greed causes you to work, but only things that are in your self-interest are good. Well, that's not what my philosophical leader says. My philosophical leader's name is Jesus. And my philosophical leader says that greed is not good. And I want to share with you a principle, and it's this. Freedom and immorality cannot coexist. Freedom and immorality cannot coexist ever in any system or any form. We want freedom we want free markets, and we want freedom in all systems, but we want freedom in our economic system. But as immorality rises, as immorality increases, folks, you lose your freedoms, because as the immorality increases, you have to have more laws and regulations to restrain the immorality, because the immorality is causing harm. So if we want freedom in all of our system and in all of our culture and in our economic system, we have to return to immorality. It's not possible for freedom and greed to coexist in an economic system, because the greed will devour people, and then you'll lose your freedoms trying to restrain the greed. And I want to say that was wrong. Greed is not a virtue. Greed is a sin, and it's wrong. And I want to step out here, and I want to say some things to you, and I want to say this. God is going to come and He's going to deal with our greed, and I'm going to step out here and say this. God is going to begin to deal with Wall Street. I don't know how. The big banking systems, the central banking systems, the greed that's on Wall Street, the level of greed. I remember George Bush during the housing crisis say we've become drunk on our greed. With the amount of money we've printed since 2008 and 9, my goodness, greed is just rampant, and they have learned that it's okay to be greedy, because they're just going to be bailed out anyway. I'm going to tell you something. They may have gotten bailed out by earthly governments, but they're not going to get bailed out by the government of heaven, because God sees the greed, and God's going to come and deal with the greed. And this is I believe this is the Lord. Do you know why God's going to deal with the greed? Because it's destroying the poor and the oppressed. And I really believe in my heart of hearts, the thought that the Lord put in my heart. This is just my view. I could be wrong. But the pain that people have felt, the average people have felt during this era of excessive greed on Wall Street and big banks, they're going to feel some of that pain. They're going to feel the pain. I remember in 2008, and I'm talking about economic pain, that there's going to be a reality check there. I remember in 2008 when everything was collapsing. I remember Jim Cramer, the financial guy on TV with bells and whistles and doing all this stuff. I remember when Cramer said, and they were beginning to get panicked, and he got religion on national TV. And he said, I'll tell you something that Wall Street needs to do if we ever come out of this mess in the middle of the heat of the battle when Lehman Brothers went under. He said, Wall Street needs to tithe. I never thought I would hear anybody on Wall Street say that, but he's right. If Wall Street would ever come to a point, and the wealthy banking centers would come to a point where they would honor God with the tithe, it would revolutionize America. But I'm just going to tell you the pain that Main Street has felt for years and years and years. I believe God's going to show up, and He's going to deal with the greed. Let me say it that way. He's not going to deal with the institution. We need that. I love investments, and I had an investment club at our church. But He's going to deal with the greed. And God's coming after the greed, because God is a God of the vulnerables. The fatherless, the widow, the orphan, the helpless, the powerless. And He sees that greed has been causing destruction with people and even with our nation. And God wants an awakening in our nation. Everybody look, He wants an awakening in our nation, folks. And He can't bless us if the heart of our system and the heart of our people is filled with greed. He's going to come and deal with it. I almost forgot to, because greed is killing our country. See this book by Timothy Keller? And I will end with this. I know that's the third time I've said that. I don't care. I guess I give up on just who I am. The name of the book on justice is called Generous Justice. You know why Tim Keller named it Generous Justice? Because greed and justice are incompatible. You cannot carry out justice if you are filled with greed. You can only carry out justice if you're willing to be generous and share and have a heart for others. That's God's heart. God is generous with what He's given us, and He wants to be a people that are generous with others. And I went after the powerful who oppress people in different ways to make us think about that side of the equation, because to whom much is given, much is required, and the powerful are the people that actually have the right to change things. But God's going to deal with Wall Street, and it's been blowing up. Wall Street's just been soaring through the sky for many, many years. But there's a day of reckoning, as Isaiah 10 says. And I pray for the people that are there. I pray that they would get, as Cramer did, get religion. I pray that they would find Jesus. But I pray that they would get a heart to be generous. I pray that, Lord, I'm going to pray right now as I close this. I pray that every person who is powerful, who is wealthy, who is in a position to make these kind of changes, I pray that they would get a heart of filled with generosity and justice and righteousness and equity and fairness. You want us to be blessed. You want us to be prosperous. But you want us to be free, but you want prosperity and freedom with a heart of generousness and equity and justice. So as we think about unjust laws, exploiting the poor, usury and interest rates, I pray that you'd prompt someone to possibly do credit unions, to set up a model for credit unions and things like that in the kingdom of God. Father, all these things we talked about, wages that maybe people will be convicted about sharing and taking care of their workers, I pray that we'd be people of righteousness and justice. And as I talked about some of the problems from a structural perspective tonight, in Jesus' name, amen. Amen.